Okay, Donker Simbole, or the symbols. So let's start with the most obvious one, which is the spinnerak, or the web, the spider's web. Down the side here, I've given you the page numbers for reference, so it's just a very brief reference to the symbols or some common themes that I thought might be useful. So die eerste een, when Greg drives from Joburg down to Stellenbosch to go and study by Marties, he sees the child prostitutes in Beaufort Wes, and he talks about the web of poverty. Then once in Stellenbosch, there's a granite bench by this art gallery. There's a crack in the U, and it's engraved with trust. So it refers to broken trust, gebroken vertroue, en dit laat Greg aan Zander dink. And he talks about the thread of the spider, of the memories makes the web shudder, or it makes the web shake. Dan het Greg se idea to try and catch the baker. He calls it like the first thread of the spider's web. When they talk about Dr. Rian Trollip, which was one of the suspects as being the baker, Greg onthou dat John, sy broer, it said that the blue veins on Dr. Rian Trollip's hands looks like a spider web. And then later Greg wonders, was it really Dr. Trollip or was it the pianist? They had some fancy soiree at their house, and he can't remember, was it Dr. Trollip's hands or the pianist's hands? Don't think that's super important, but yeah. Then when Greg goes and researches Dr. Trollip, and he says it's like a spider that spans its web even further. So Greg is looking for articles about Trollip's wife. When Greg visits his dad in jail in Gossi Mampuru, die tweede gevangenis, vir die Paasnaweek, the Easter weekend, when he goes back, he says the tension is like a web. Then after Tom's death, Greg and Dane February, remember he's one of the students with Greg by Marties. They talk about Tom's death, and there's this reference that the web gets more threads. At one stage, Greg and Plank are hanging out, they kuier, and Greg tells him that he's seen Zander, and while they're having a beer, Greg draws the web in the, like the damp on the beer glass. When Greg is researching or looking for the baker and they find the Elsewhere website reference, Greg said it's like spinnekop gif, like spider's poison. The fear is spreading like spider's poison through Greg. Then at one stage, Greg thinks Ayla's dad is the baker, even though he looks very innocent. I mean, he works for Doctors Without Borders. And Greg says, well, a spider's web also looks very innocent. Totdat a fly lands in there. So it looks quite innocent until you're caught up in it. So he suspects Ayla's dad. Then Greg, while he's also considering suspects, who could be the baker, he thinks of Andre Symington. Remember, Andre was his mother's, lover, while his father was in prison, whom he also met during that Easter weekend. He went to visit his dad. And he says the spider's web of Greg's intuition shudders when he thinks of Andre Symington. Maybe he is the baker. Then when they are all in Venice, Dirk and Greg and Ayla and Zander and everyone, they have this strijdkamer, like this war room. And like you see in the movies, sometimes they put up the pictures on the wall and they put these little strings to connect suspects and things. So it was like a web of the strings that they connected in their war room. Dan, wanneer hulle daai hele Taylor Swift with the facial recognition software, which they load on this cell phones to try and find the baker in Venice, and they say the lines of the facial recognition software, it's like an electronic web on the faces as it scans the faces. And dan heel aan die einde, it says the baker closes his eyes as if he's pulling together all these little threads of the lies, the corruption, the bribery, and the death. Then moving on to the snakes. So it starts where they describe the Canale Grande in Venice as a snake, dis die Canal in Venetia. Greg says his ouerhuis, his home, feels there's a heavy feeling, like a curled up snake, after his dad went to jail and all the laughter's gone, his brother's committed suicide. It's not a happy home anymore. When Greg is chasing Zander in Stellenbosch, there's reference to he sees an artwork with snakes. Then in Turkey, Istanbul. The Basilica cistern, there's Medusa. Of course, we discuss her in the mythology video. She's got snakes for hair. And then Greg also thinks that, Xander is a snake, because Greg thinks, am I waiting for a snake now down there in the Basilica cistern? The snake being Xander. And Greg also says that is what makes a snake, because you can get a snake in any place. Again, it could be Xander. Then in Florence, is it Florence? I'm doubting myself now. Greg goes to meet Dirk, and there's a cut off Medusa head. Talk about the Gordian knot, which is also discussed in the mythology video, the Gordian knot of snakes, when Greg finds out his dad is in hospital. Remember, the baker got one of his henchmen to get to Greg's dad in prison and attacked him and he's in the hospital. Again, they talk about the Canal, all these water channels in Venice is like a snake. Greg tries to convince Ayla. At one stage, he thinks that Xander is busy with a social engineering attack on Ayla, of a sociale manipuleringsaanval. And then he says to Ayla, remember, snakes remain snakes. And the baker then says at the end that these dark undercurrents of the world is like snakes that what krioel. Just a bunch of snakes moving around. And Greg, they can't kill it, they can't stop him. And aan die einde, when Greg, they flee in a boat in a smaller canal in Venice, they talk about the snake's head, where they reach the Canale Grande after Xander has shot the baker. Let's see, how much time do we have? The water. So Tom visits Greg in Stellenbosch, and as he's chasing him, they land up in the NG Moederkerk, is the church, and there on the pulpit there's like a piece of cloth hanging, and it talks about a river of living water. Greg says the water dripping is like his chances to find the baker is just it's disappearing. That is when Xander found out about the transponder that Greg did an implant, and Xander walked away. Then when they are in Istanbul, there's all the lights playing on the water. It's a very poignant moment between Planck and Greg, and they're happy they can still be friends and look at the lights on the water in a strange country. They talk about all the water while they are in Turkey, looking from Xander and Ayla's woonstel. The Halij, I don't know how you say that, die Goue Horing is on the Bosporus River. And then, of course, that palindrome, the Griekse palindrome that Xander sends Greg, that says, wash the sins, not only the face. And water then being symbolic of death and rebirth. So this was found many times in doopfonte, like baptismal fonts in churches. That's the water. Then we come to the bridges. Yeah, there's quite a few bridges in the story. So the first one, Thomas Lawson says this to Greg when he goes and fetches his stuff from Lawson College. Because remember, Greg left halfway through matric. And Thomas Lawson says that never burn a bridge to find your way in the dark. Bridges burn, but so do people in their dreams. And then his mother quotes that to him when she tells him Thomas Lawson has invited him for dinner. The Eerste Rivier Brug in Stellenbosch, that's where they find Tom's lake, or his body. Greg crosses that bridge every day on his way to class. So they wonder, was Tom's dood a message for Greg? Because it was left where he would see it. Then Greg also says bridges are like, they can either be a struikelblok, a hindrance, or a sign of hope. And that's like a turning point for Greg, where he realizes he's going over to something darker. When Greg is chasing Xander in Stellenbosch, there's a wooden bridge that he crosses in the botanical gardens. Again, there's Thomas Lawson's bridge quote about don't burn your bridges. It's where Greg and Xander are thinking of verdachtes, suspects, who can be the baker. The Rialto Brug in Venice, that's where Greg tries to convince of oortuig vir Ayla that Xander is busy with a social engineering attack. And then the Punta della Paglia, of die brug van sigte, the bridge of sighs. That's where Greg leaves the cell phone with the facial recognition software to try and catch the baker walking past, and he goes to fetch a power bank by hulle woonstel. And then, the Conrad Botes skildery, oopsie, what am I doing? Sorry. No, cancel, back. Die Greg Botes skildery, so it's a self-portrait van Conrad Botes, sorry. It was a gift from Greg's mom. While Greg is in the anatomy lab by Stellenbosch, he thinks of the painting and the existence of man. I think the most important thing probably is that Greg, that burnt book that is anonymously sent to Greg, where the word Valkyrie appears in, he hides that book in a couvert, in an envelope. He sticks it to the back of the Conrad painting. And then Greg thinks again about this painting after Zander vra om verskoning. He apologizes for what he's done to Greg. Greg thinks about this painting and he says, the temptation to exist, or should it rather be the temptation to perish? And then Kluwen or cloning, a few references to that. So Greg repeats Zander's words, we become clones of our dads. When Planck says that, remember, I'm in Wilgenhof course, because my dad was there, like we become what our dads were. Greg gets Ritalin from Dane February, his student friend, and it makes him feel like a clone of himself. And then, of course, Chloe uses the clone function of Photoshop when she clones Greg Sahant so that it must look as if he's implanted the transponder that Zander said. Because remember, Planck implanted the transponder. I think there's one more. They talk about the Mexicans say the 3 deaths. I don't know if that's important. Page 14. So when you die, you sterf, jy maak jou oë toe. Begrawe is when you're buried, and then when nobody remembers you. That's your 3rd death. The Mexicans say that you die 3 times. And to stop this last one, before Greg leaves Sandhurst for Stellenbosch, hy neem 'n foto met sy selfoon. He takes a photo of a photograph of John, his brother, to take with to Stellenbosch. And then Lawson College se leuse, their motto, dis lux hominum vita, lig is die lewe vir die mensdom, or light is life for humanity. So when Greg left Lawson College the last time, he noticed the motto on his school blazer as he was packing all his things. Greg, again, when they land in Istanbul airport, he thinks back to this motto. And when Zander tells the story of Prometheus, which is discussed in detail in the mythology video, Zander said it sounds like mottos, like Lawson's motto, which, there's obvious parallels between Prometheus and this motto, where Prometheus stole light to give to man and was then subsequently punished by Zeus. I think that takes care of all the recurring themes and ideas and things. I hope not all of them are needed, but there you go.